Okay, and we're off and running. As many of you know, we're just coming out of February, which has traditionally become African American Heritage and History Month. And I cannot presume to be an expert on Montana's African American population, but I can tell you that there are some amazing stories. And so that's why we're here, is to hear the stories. And the first thing I'm going to do is move this box. Okay. Um, so as far as historians know, the first African American to come to this side of the country and seen by a good share of African or Native Americans was York, who of course was Clark's slave. And I think his may be the most interesting story of all. And I shouldn't start with the best one, but I'm going to anyway, so bear with me. So imagine York was born a slave. He was given to Clark when Clark was a young child. And essentially, Clark and York grew up together. But again, York was Clark's slave. And he initially, when he was brought on to the core discovery, he focused on Clark and probably continued the routines that they had started before the Corps of Discovery left the East. But eventually he worked his way into a very equal position because, and part of that was Clark, because he would often leave decisions, say what side of the river do you want to camp on, that sort of thing, to the crew as a whole. And so before the end of that first winter that they spent, that they spent on the Oregon coast, York had a voice in what was going on. But then sadly, he returns to the east with Clark, and returning to the east, he returned to that world of slavery and bondage. Eventually, Clark did free York, but not until 1815. He gave him a wagon and horses for freight hauling, and business failed, and York died of cholera sometime, and this is sad, we only know it was between 1822 and 1832. And as if you've heard me talk before, you know I often manage to get a Charlie Russell painting in here, and so I've done that obligation. Come on. Okay. There we go. Yep. Patience. Okay. So a quick overview of what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at a timeline, and that will give us a perspective of which settlements had the most African Americans and which time frames may have we enjoyed more African American citizens than otherwise. So talk about the numbers, the early Western opportunities. We're going to look at the communities, specifically later on Helena and Great Falls, and the amazing individuals that came out of those. And then I'm going to have lots of stories about the individual triumphs, but also the power in teamwork. Boy, I am sorry, this does not want to change. Yeah. Oh dear.
That's okay. We had this hiccup last time and we're not too far into it. Oh, there we go.
Okay, again, patience. So again, York entered the territory with Lewis and Clark in 1805. Interestingly enough, and I find this interesting, the fur trade enlisted a lot of men of color. And this is for a myriad of reasons. One is because the fur trade, because of its very birth in Canada and the US, was multiracial, because whether a trader was Scottish or French or came from the East Coast of the United States, he traditionally took a Native American wife. And so as African Americans made their way up the Missouri, they, I hope, found a level of comfort in some of those communities, particularly Fort Benton. And Fort Benton, we're going to talk about in a little bit. Some of the highlights. In 1866 to 1890, Montana benefits from the creation and disbursement of Buffalo Soldier regiments. In 1893, and if any of you know Libby, this just, I always shake my head, Montana's first Black attorney was a resident of Montana. His name was John Poston, and he was later appointed to the U.S. Commissioner for the District Court. 1894, we see the first of 3 African-American newspapers in Montana. And they get, I'm going to say, a little more radical each time another one is established. Some of the things that African-Americans are up against was the segregation of schools starting in 1872. In 1909, the Montana legislature outlawed mixed marriages. And there were several mixed marriages in the state. Let's see, KKK shows up in Montana in 1921. That's a topic all of itself. In 1951 to 55, particularly due to the work of African-American women's group, there's a battle to pass a bill banning segregation in places of public accommodation. And they work for 2, maybe 3 different legislative sessions to get that passed, and they do. All right, quick look at population. As you can see, African Americans, as far as I know, have never made up more than 1 or 2% of Montana's population. But it's astounding when we start looking at the individuals and the lives they led, as well as the groups that they formed to celebrate themselves and to create community. So here early on, Fort Benton, fur trade, and then you see Helena with that 420. A good share of those are men who were what we term Buffalo soldiers and retired in Montana, specifically in Helena. And then Great Falls has its own route that, quite honestly, most of their numbers are a little bit later here. All right, the fur company. I've already talked about some of the dynamics with the fur company. And yes, Fort Benton was the most inland port in the United States until the construction of Fort Pitt Dam. It's amazing. And if you want to talk multiracial, the family, one of the families who established Fort Benton was, Alexander Culbertson and his wife, Natowista. She was Blackfeet, and she was by his side. There's a great book called Frontier Diplomats, and they were partners in this adventure. Fort Benton eventually wound up having a lot of, and it's booming, remember, Fort Benton has several Black businessmen, and I'm not talking about 3 streets down, I'm talking Main Street businesses, and then there were several also who were in partnership with white partners. Then James Beckworth is an interesting character, and he was a mountain man who roamed the West a little bit earlier than the Fort Benton capitalists, but he wound up living with both the Blackfeet as well as the Crow, and he left behind memoirs, and they are really interesting. Okay. Now, 2 entrepreneurs. On the left, I'm going to talk about Samuel Lewis. That is his sister, Edmonia, that we see. That is Mr. Lewis's house. It's on the National Registry of Historic Places. But he was from the West Indies. His parents migrated to New Jersey. Mr. Lewis traveled, mined, and barbered in California, Oregon, Idaho, Raidersburg, and Virginia City. And by 1868, he has settled in Bozeman, but not before he takes 2 years off to travel the world. He built his own shop and later built several business buildings, and he was much praised for the homes that he built. He took in his sister Edmonia after the death of their parents, And she wound up being a very well-known sculptress in Europe. Mr. Lewis helped send her to several prestigious schools, and she did eventually study in Europe and opened her own sculpture studio in Rome. Amazing, amazing. When Mr. Lewis passed away, his obit read that he was a businessman and that he would be missed. And then we have Sarah Bickford, and another one of those drop dead or drop my jaw stories. So Mrs. Bickford was born a slave, and she met a local attorney in Tennessee while she was living with a sister, and he offered her a job if she would come to Montana Territory with him to tend to his 2 foster children. She was just a teenager, but she exchanged her services as a nanny for her passage into Montana Territory. Initially, she worked as a chambermaid, and she did eventually marry John Brown. They had 3 children. Before the marriage ended, 2 of the children had passed away. And here's something that any woman doing it in this day and age, in the 1860s and 70s, let's say not encouraged to do, but Sarah Bickford filed for divorce from her first husband. And she claimed that there was abuse in the marriage. So she got the children, again, very unheard of, and proceeded to get on with her life. She married in 1883, Stephen Bickford, and the couple had three little girls and a boy. They owned 2/3 of the Virginia City Water Company. Once after Mr. Bickford died in 1890, Sarah took a business management class by correspondence, amazing, purchased the remaining third of the company, and in 1902 became the sole owner of the utility. And there is the chance that she was the first African-American woman to own a utility in the continental United States. She was quite the businesswoman, and there are wonderful stories about her going from door to door to collect the fees that she is owed. But she seemed to be really liked, except on the one point where she raised the water prices. But the prices had stayed the same for 40 years before she raised them. So you got to give her credit for that. Now the military. Now I've mentioned the Buffalo Soldiers, and I'm certainly going to mention them again. But there were 2 cavalries, the infantries. They were the 24th and the 25th, that eventually they went through Arizona and the Apache Wars, and then up through the West. They were exposed to a lot of violence, a lot of battles. But by the 1880s, they were settling, African-American soldiers were settling in several forts across Montana. There was Fort Shaw, Fort McGinnis, Fort Keogh, Cinnabon, Fort Harrison, Fort Missoula, and my personal favorite, Fort Custer, which was on the bluffs above Hardin, Montana. Captain Bivens perhaps is the most famous of the group, or certainly the most widely decorated. He was born to free Black farmers in Virginia and attended college. He joined the military in 1887 and again followed that route, Arizona, the Apache Wars. He came to Montana eventually with the 10th Cavalry. Now in 1898, he went to Cuba and won many medals fighting in Cuba. And he wrote one of the first accounts of that war called Under Fire with the 10th Cavalry. Of particular fun is his dog there, Booth, on the right. And there are stories of Booth being in battle with Mr. Bivens and his infantry. And when there was a fallen soldier, Booth would park himself next to the fallen soldier until someone came to their aid. Makes me want to cry. Well, eventually, Mr. Bivens does retire in 1913 as a taxidermist in Billings. Believe it or not, when World War I starts, he re-enlists. Amazing, amazing. But speaking of the military, we can't talk about African Americans in the military without talking about the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps. As you probably can imagine, in 1890, bicycles were pretty high tech. And the military gave Lieutenant Moss out of Fort Missoula official status in 1896 to study the feasibility of using bicycles. He was very pro bicycle, and as he said, the bikes did not take much care. They did not need forage. They moved faster over good roads, qualifier good roads, but he believed that probably the best scenario was somehow incorporate a bicycle corps as adjutants for the military and cavalry. So the men started training, and in 1896, they went from Missoula to Yellowstone and then to Lake McDonald and back again. Oh, excuse me, from Missoula to Yellowstone, and here they are at on the terraces there, and then they went to Lake McDonald. July the 14th of 1897, these men with 59 pounds of bedroll and supplies took 1,900 miles to go to St. Louis, and they were hailed as they came into St. Louis. Sadly, as we all know, the bicycles did not become a major part of our military. And those Spalding bikes had been made specifically for Moss, and his men were sent back to Spalding. A woman who certainly deserves a page of her own. And certainly Mary Fields is bigger than life to so many people. After the Civil War, she worked on a riverboat. She met a judge. He hired her as a servant. As it would happen, the judge, Judge Dunn, had a sister who was an Ursuline nun. Her name was Mother Mary Amadeus. And she eventually brings Ursulines out to establish St. Peter's Mission, and Miss Fields comes with her. Of course, Miss Fields has a reputation for dressing comfortably. She carried a gun, she smoked, she drank, and cussed. And I think it's the cussing that got her in trouble, because while she was at the mission, she sadly earned the attention of Bishop Rondell for her rough persona and habits. And I think it was that cussing. So she was asked carefully, maybe not so carefully, to leave St. Peter's Mission, but she managed to get around it by delivering mail to St. Peter's Mission in Cascade from 1895 to 1903. She loved baseball and was obviously a big fan of the local baseball teams. And she died in 1914 and left quite a story. Gary Cooper remarked that she was in the best sense a pioneer woman. She was rough, she was tough, but lived to become one of the freest souls ever to draw breath. All right, a few homesteaders. I'm going to jump right into Agnes Morgan. And Agnes Morgan came to the Western Territories, worked in the military households for quite some time. And then after being widowed, she wound up settling in Phillipsburg for some reason. At that time, she was hired to care for Granite County's attorney, David Durfee's alcoholic uncle. And according to legend, the family settles her and the alcoholic uncle in a very isolated cabin, and he eventually became cured. I'm going to leave that up to your imagination. But once he returned to society, she stayed on at the farm. She filed for a homestead. And interestingly enough, one day she literally stumbled on a Civil War veteran by the name of Joseph Fisher Jack Case, who was sick. And she nursed him back to health, and he never left. This is a picture of the next homestead that we're going to talk about, and that's Bertie Brown's. And her name is spelled various ways, but more consistently than not, it's B-E-R-T-I Brown. And Bertie was just like every other homesteader. She wanted a section of her own land. She was outside of, obviously, thank heaven, in the mountains above Lewistown. And she did everything she was humanly possible to make extra money. She raised chickens, she sold eggs, she sold butter, and she sold the best moonshine in the Fergus County area. And according to locals, not only was her moonshine the best, it was the safest. The next homesteader, and we can debate whether Mr. Morgan is a homesteader or not, but that's where I chose to put him. Mr. Morgan, again, initially in the Navy, winds up settling in Cascade County in that area. He came up the Missouri River and arrived at Fort Benton in 1882. And after, again, he worked at the river port and he hired on at different ranches on the Sun River. He began homesteading in 1886, 5 miles south of Great Falls along the Missouri River. And he received a patent to his 158 acres. 5 years later, he would eventually have a ranch over 700 acres. As Great Falls began to grow, Morgan built a house in town and became active in the community, serving as a founding trustee and building the African Methodist Church. And he helped establish a Black Masonic Lodge. And this is interesting. So he was an active Republican, and he was, to use a quote, appointed to a plum political job as janitor of the Cascade County courthouse. However, he was nominated at the Republican Convention of 1894 to be constable for Great Falls. So the night of November 6th, Morgan went to bed in the evening after working that day as janitor at the courthouse. He woke the next day to learn that he'd received the majority of votes to become the constable. And this, as far as I know, marked the first election of a Black Montanan to public office in Montana. He served in that capacity for some time, and then he went back to the ranch. He died there in 1899, and his obituary says, "Death of a good citizen." And then the Gordon family of White Sulphur Springs. And these are the two, I'm going to say, famous Gordons. Their parents, Mary and John, established themselves in White Sulphur Springs in the early 1880s. John worked as a chef and he made enough money to buy a house for the family. Sadly, he was killed in a train accident just 10 years later, and Mary takes on raising 5 children, raises them by cooking, doing laundry, and home nursing. 2 of the siblings left quite the mark on Montana and the United States. First, we have Rose there on the right, and she, more than anything, wanted to become a nurse. And she attempted to leave for nursing college several times, but was called back due to family crisis. Eventually, she settled in White Sulphur Springs, worked in the restaurant business for her mom, but eventually, taking every opportunity she could for nurses training, wound up a masseuse, a physical therapist, and homeopathic treatments. And she worked with the physicians of White Sulphur Springs for several years. Aside from medicine, writing was Rose's passion, and she was a regular contributor to the Marr County News. And I'm going to say she, in many ways, seemed to be the social conscience of Marr County for many decades with her article. And then her brother, we've got Taylor Gordon. He did leave White Sulphur Springs for a time after working for John Ringling as a driver and a chef. And he joined, this is amazing, he joined other African Americans in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance as a talented and popular gospel singer and vaudeville act in the 1920s. By 1959, he has returned home and he dies in 1971. He's also known for writing a book called Born to Be Free. All right, and then we've got Helena's progressive population, and I made an extra slide for this for those of you who have seen this before. First, we've got James Ball. He's on the left. He was a photographer. He apprenticed with another African-American photographer in Boston, and through a course of several years, finally winds up in Montana in 1887. During his time in Helena, he had his own studio and he documented the African-American community and became politically active. He moved to Seattle in 1900, and I like to think that he retired in Hawaii because he passed away in Hawaii in 1904. Then we have Joseph Bass. He was a journalist and he was able to walk a line between establishment and activism. He published the third of 3 African-American newspapers. His was called the Montana Plain Dealer, and he definitely used it as a forum to rally African-American communities as well as to point out the injustices suffered by those communities. So of the newspapers, we have the Colored Citizen, which is Helena in 1894, the New Age, which is Butte from 02 and 03, and then Mr. Bass's paper, which ran from 06 to 1911. And then we have Miss Bridgewater. Oh my gosh. She wound up a second lieutenant. She was one of the first African-American nurses accepted for military duty during World War II. She trained as a nurse in the late 1920s in one of the few schools teaching African-American women, the Lincoln School in the Bronx. Upon returning to Montana after her military service, she was eventually hired by St. Peter's and worked the maternity ward for decades. She continued to be active in the community. And then we have another amazing story. And I felt that Mr. Anderson deserved his own page because I wanted you to see his mixology books. So Mr. Anderson tended bar. He was the mixologist at the Montana Club for 60 years. And starting in 1919 and then in 1943 and 1953, the 53 was for his 60th anniversary, he had created a recipe book for drinks. And we do have a copy here at the Historical Society. He used his position to train and employ multiple African Americans, and he was much respected. I hope some of you have seen his recipe book. Great Falls has left a great legacy. The First Lady is on the left. Oh, remember that first picture I showed of a mother and three beautiful daughters? This is the daughter furthest on the right with the big bow in her hair. This is Alma Jacobs. She was raised in Lewistown and Great Falls. She became a cataloger after going to school in 1946, head librarian in Great Falls in 1954. She had that post for almost 20 years. During that time, she lobbied for improved library space, and she succeeded in having a new building built in 1967. She became the Montana State Librarian from 1973 through 81, and she was one of the co-founders of Humanities Montana. The first African-American legislators, Geraldine Travis, and her House district was Maelstrom Air Force Base. And the dynamics here aren't surprising because, of course, Maelstrom is responsible for really integrating Great Falls population. And she was, I understand, just a little on the liberal side and great. Then now we're going into a couple of groups. And I had the Ozark Club as a group. The Ozark Club was an African-American owned club. It went through many, many reincarnations, but the club succeeded to run for several years, several decades actually, with a lot of African-American entertainment coming through. And it started as a private Black club, but it eventually welcomed all races. And sadly, it burned down. But the Ozark Club holds a great place in Montana's history. And as you can see, they had a lot of entertainment. All right. Now my last group, this is the Montana Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. And by the time they meet in Butte in the 1920s, there's already over a half a dozen colored women's clubs in the state. They were amazingly proactive. And part of it is because they believed in coming together and working as a group. They were like every other women's club. They raised money for scholarships, but they also lobbied. And my two favorite stories is the groups around the state rallied when in at least 1953, there was a legislative move to guarantee people of every color access to public places. And it did not pass in 1953, but by 1955, it has passed, much in large due to the work of these women. Another story is a group in Billings. There was a large department store that I will not name who would not allow African-American women to try on outfits. And so they banned that store. And it didn't take long before the store had to give in because, again, these women had a lot of clout. Amazing. Amazing. As we get into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there is a trickle and then an exodus of African Americans out of Montana, by and large because the opportunities here have really narrowed down. And if you'll recall, we had quite the crash in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and there was very little work to be had. Now, a good share of this information I got from two different sites. One is Women's History Matters. These are both sponsored by the Montana Historical Society. Women's History Matters was organized by a colleague by the name of Martha Cole. And then on the right, we have Montana's African American Heritage site. And both of these sites have won awards for their content and just for the sake of their existence. The African American Heritage goes on, it's got more information than I would ever want in my long-term memory. It's got census information, biographies, trends, and if you're interested, I would recommend that you get on here and find the paper written by Delia Hagen, because she wrote the book on African American history in Montana. And she's kind of a fun read, quite honestly. Okay, I hope I haven't gone too fast. Oh my gosh. As I've said, there are places on the internet to go to find more Montana African American resources. But in closing, I would just like to point out that African Americans came to Montana and for this territory for the reason every other person did, whether you're German or Swedish or Irish, they came for the opportunities. And many of them thrived as they faced the challenges of not only homesteading or getting a job, but as they faced and had to live with, they did not learn to live with, but had to live with the prejudice. And so I just have always tried to imagine, and I can't, what that was like to trying to get a life established and having part of your culture not happy you're there. But on the other hand, this is just the tip of the iceberg of the stories of what African Americans have given to Montana. And I hope that you'll pursue more information.
So Zoanne, if you're up for it, if folks have any questions or need you to repeat anything, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves and ask whatever questions you might have.
Yes.
Or, you know, if you mentioned a book or a website that somebody needs to hear again.
You bet. And my email is on the MHS library staff list. I'm the only Zoanne on staff, so feel free to email anytime.
Got a really cranky kid here, but so if you hear him fussing, that's what's going on.
That's
Joyce
okay.
was mentioning that she had read a really good book about African Americans in Montana with an author of the last name of McKenzie. It was about the area of Phillipsburg, Montana. Have you?
McKenzie, Phillipsburg, Montana. That is not ringing a bell. Ken Robeson out of Fort Benton has written a really good book, but I'm not familiar with McKenzie, but I'm going to look it up.
Okay, I was trying to real quick, but I didn't manage to find it in the short time that I had, so.
You bet. You just hold that baby. Anything else? I think he has a question.
Yeah. I loved some of the added stories that you added today. So I do have one question. If you want to go back one slide from what you are on now, about the African American, the group of, I think it was a women's group. That one.
Yes.
Was anyone allowed to join that just to support them? Because I noticed one person in there that looked like a man, and I could be wrong. Just be the photo.
As far as I know, the group was only open to women of color.
Okay.
And to add
But
a
I
little
must be wrong, and it's just the darker coloring of the photographs that makes it look that way.
wonderful diversity. But just to pique your interest, their records landed here at the Montana Historical Society. And when I say that, I mean their original records and the minutes to their meetings, the list of membership, as well as a cookbook that they created in 1925. And so again, that legacy that was left behind, we've got their voices and their perspectives on many cases, and what a gift that is to Montanans.
I love that there's a little girl in that photo.
Yes.
Already part of the group.
Yep. Look how well she's sitting. Oh my. Well, let me go back and get that early photo of Elma Jacobs, because I'm sorry I didn't point that out. Come on. Okay. So Elma was raised right around Lewistown, and this is her mother, Emma Riley Harris Smith, and her two sisters. And again, Elma, the woman who is destined to become the Montana State Librarian, is the lovely girl with the bow. I can't tell if it's a bow or a hat in her hair. I think it's a bow. So amazing to have that kind of record of her. A photo of her in her childhood, and then lots in her adulthood. Well, I hope I get some questions, and don't hesitate to question about anything that's been in the past. If something has come up about oh, let's see, holiday cooking and holiday stories, or history brands of livestock, history of livestock brands, please give me a holler. Would love to talk to you about it.
Well, Zoanne, as always, thank you so much. We love having you, and we really appreciate your time. And we hope we'll see you again soon. Maria, do you know off the top of your head when we have Zoanne again?
Nope, not off the top of my head. I can look. Just real quick here. Calendar. I think it's not till April.
Okay.
On the 17th, we have a PopKnowledge with They're Aware with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And then I think...
I remember, we're going to do something about the Titanic.
Oh, yes, because that's around April.
That's April 12th it went down. So I'll double check.
14th. On the 14th, we're doing PopKnowledge with you on the Titanic. Montana's ties to the Titanic. I'm looking forward to that one majorly.
Yes, me too.
Wow. You want stories? Yes. That's unbelievable. Okay, everybody.
You always have good stories.
Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day.
Thank you, Zoanne.
Hear from you.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Bye-bye.